Game teams not playing their own game is a mistake we see almost every team make and is one of the easiest to avoid.
What's up, everybody? Warren from Upptic here, and this week we have something a little different. We wanted to put together our top tips for soft launching games. So we soft launch a lot of games here, and recently I sat down with Jerry, one of our growth leads here, and we put together some short tips for each of the 3 phases of soft launch as we normally recommend them and best practices. I hope you enjoy this content today. It's pretty actionable, and hopefully it can ensure that you have a better soft launch outcome for your game. Here we go. We figured we would just start from the top with a soft launch. Jerry, what is a game soft launch and why should teams give it?
Yeah, soft launching is a really important step in launching your game, and it's essentially a first public test of your game targeted to very specific regions with key KPIs to test against. Soft launching can give you a really indication of what works about your game, but most importantly, what might not be working about your game. It allows you to test things like server stability, retention, and monetization, and ultimately, if your game will be a success or not. So, Warren, why do teams do it?
Teams soft launch because ultimately it's going to save them a lot of money and potentially do a lot of risk mitigation. So you're going to learn a lot in your soft launch. You're going to learn about the key bugs and issues you need to fix with your game. You're going to learn about the player funnel where you're losing them and need to tweak that. And then you're going to learn about the monetization and potential ROI of the game on global launch. By testing these with a small controlled budget and user group in soft launch, it's going to let you address all these issues before you expend your primary marketing budget, and it's going to ensure you get way better ROI if it's a viable game, or it's going to do a huge risk mitigation and identify if your game is non-viable so you can save that budget for your next game instead. Jerry, what are the main phases of a soft launch?
You have essentially 3 stages: your tech test, retention test, your monetization test, and then a go or no go. So now that we talked about the stages of it, what are KPIs you're looking for within a soft launch?
The KPIs you're looking for are going to correspond to the stage of soft launch. So in the tech test, your KPIs are around things like crashes and basic progression in the very beginning of the game. Is the core loop of the game working? And is the server stable? Going on to the retention test, as you could probably guess, you're measuring retention. This is usually what you'd call day 1 through day 7 retention, and looking at how users progress on their user journey, if they're sticking around, if they're progressing through that medium-term funnel. And then going lastly to the monetization test, as you would guess, you are testing the economy. You're measuring the ARPU, average revenue per user, the LTV, the lifetime value, and how these mature as people move through the journey. You're also looking at the price points and frequency of different types of purchases within the game to test that part of the economy as well.
We'll dive deeper into the first stage of a soft launch, the tech test, and the top 3 things to look out for.
Tip number 1, the tech launch is a chance to QA your data and tracking before you spend any real money. So the data piping is not sexy, but it's very important, and you want to validate it here at the tech test before you expand to larger and more expensive marketing stages. In particular, you want to make sure that you fully implement what's called an attribution provider. That's going to be able to tie the results of your marketing efforts towards the in-game behavior, such as retention and player spending. For mobile games, this attribution provider could be one of the common providers like Adjust, Singular, or AppsFlyer. For PC games, we really like GameSite. You also want to validate at this stage that purchases are working correctly and that you have everything you need to populate any marketing dashboards that you're going to be using in the future phases.
And tip number 2, this is your first opportunity to validate your basic game loop with unbiased players. So you want to look at, does the game work and have a baseline level of functionality? This is your first chance at getting a player's unbiased view of your game and your first chance to get unbiased gameplay feedback. You want to look for things like server stability, identify bugs and squash them as early as possible, and any outlier data points. For example, if you have a 95% drop off after app open, that's indicative of a very critical bug in the player onboarding.
Tip number 3, you're going to get some very exciting KPIs in the tech test, but you want to take them with a grain of salt. So you're going to see some numbers and you'll probably be tempted to scrutinize them with a magnifying glass, but resist that urge. One thing we recommend is to always look at the cohorts in this phase in a weekly view, not a daily view, because your daily sample size is going to be very small in most cases and lead you to false conclusions. If you go to a low-cost country that we would usually recommend, maybe a market like the Philippines, for the tech test, you should also expect that that's going to also cause some bias to your metrics. If you go to a low-cost country, which we do recommend, you can expect the following biases compared to one of your primary markets like the USA. The CPI is going to look lower than it would in a market like the US. The retention will also look lower than a market like the US. And lastly, the monetization will be worse, meaning lower than a market like the US. These are all totally fine and expected behaviors. So just remember, if you do go to a low-cost market for your tech test, that you're properly baselining your metrics. The retention phase is really critical. Obviously, you need people in your game and returning to play your game before you can even model out things like monetization and profitability. So in the retention phase, you're going to be bringing in a larger cohort of players than you did in your tech test. And the goals here are really two-front. You want to make sure that your core loop and gameplay are not fundamentally broken in any way. And you want to make sure that your players are retaining and progressing through your game. So today we're going to provide a couple of quick tips to have an optimal retention phase of your soft launch.
Tip number 1, you can use your early retention signals to make projections of longer-term retention. So in this phase, we will gather early baseline retention, usually focused on player behavior for the first 7 days. This will get you a basis for projecting out a retention curve and make projections for day 30 retention and beyond. We can't always wait this many days to see how many people will stick around, so we have to project them out. These are easy to do baseline comparisons with and can indicate where to place monetization for the next stage. For example, if you have a lot of users retaining, it opens up the ability to monetize via ads.
Yeah, and this is where it can really help to be working with an experienced growth marketing team, a team that can bring in benchmarks from other games in your genre. So even if you might only have the first 7 days for your own game data, they can bring in comps and help you to build an accurate model so you can model for that longer term retention. Tip number 2. So in this phase, you're going to want to make sure you have very clean data telemetry in place. So when you're bringing players in through your user acquisition funnel, you can clearly see what's breaking in the user journey and then work with your product team to address those issues. For example, if you are seeing that you have placed a login screen very early in the flow and 80% of your users are dropping off at that login screen, that's a hint that you want to try moving that login screen to later in the onboarding process. Similarly, if you're seeing that your first-time user experience, the typical like user onboarding education, is too long and people aren't completing it, you might want to try shortening it. However, if you do this, you want to see if it has an impact on your longer term retention, because this might also mean that you're not educating people about as much of the gameplay. So this is why it's really important that you're measuring the full funnel and where those events are impacting retention.
Tip number 3, get qualitative feedback and play your game. The first people that can give you feedback on how your game will retain is your own team and your own studio and publisher. This is also a great opportunity for Web3 teams to include their community in the testing phase and have people not involved in the day-to-day of the studio give feedback on the game and its performance and how much people want to come back and play the game each day. Game teams not playing their own game is a mistake we see almost every team make and is one of the easiest to avoid.
Yeah, it's crazy how many times we've been working on an early stage game launch and there's some critical retention issue, and then just our team picking it up and playing it for 5 minutes makes it extremely clear what the issue is. So you can do this yourself. There's no magic to it. Just take a few minutes to play your game at each critical release.
The monetization phase is your third and final stop before the decision to launch your game. You want to think of this as a marketability test to see if you have a viable product that can be scaled, and you need to be prepared for a range of possible outcomes. Today, we'll cover 3 essential tips for the monetization phase of your soft launch.
Tip number 1, you want to test in proxy markets for key insights. So once you have your core monetization features and your game economy fully online, you're going to want to get about 10,000 to 20,000 players through the door from markets that are similar to your primary market without actually opening up in your primary market. So for example, if your main market is the United States, Canada and Australia are really good proxy markets with similar player spending behavior that you can test in without exposing the game to your primary market before it's ready for prime time. You're then going to be able to use the data from this player test cohort and map out future projections of game revenue and player LTV or lifetime value. And these are going to be critical for assessing if your game is actually ready for global launch.
Tip 2, identify key spending patterns. In this stage, we can assess where player spend is happening and opportunities to increase it. For example, if players are buying a battle pass as opposed to a soft currency, we can dissect why this may be happening and moves you can make to better prompt your desired player behavior. These insights are critically important to the product team to understand how to optimize the game economy and maximize a player's lifetime value.
Tip number 3, and this is a rough one, most games should be killed. And yes, this might even include yours. So this is probably a tip that most agencies are not going to tell you because they want your launch budget and their share of that. But the reality is that well over 90% of games are doomed to fail and will never be profitable. So a key unspoken function of the monetization launch is actually risk mitigation. So you're going to be testing in the monetization phase with a small controlled budget to ensure that you're not setting a larger budget on fire for your global launch. This means having really tough and honest conversations between your marketing and product teams about what the monetization phase data is actually telling you. And if there are weaknesses, are these realistically addressable and fixable? So a big difference between successful and failed game companies is that the successful ones are mitigating financial risk of any one game to ensure that they can actually test launch multiple games and eventually find a hit. So the monetization phase is your last and best opportunity to do just this. All right, so there we have it. Upptic's top tips for soft launching your game. And if you need help with your own soft launch or scaling up your game, that's what we do here at Upptic. We help games grow. So if you are building a cool game on mobile, PC, console, or Web3, or any mix of the above, you can reach us at upptic.com. That's upptic.com.